We'll conclude today's Washington Journal a little early. That is because up on Capitol Hill in the Senate Armed Services Committee, they're taking up the nomination of Army Secretary Eric Fanning to be the Secretary of the Army. So we will bring you there for that nomination hearing.
When they do show such a great
Here on C-SPAN, we're live on Capitol Hill, the Dirksen Senate Office Building. The Armed Services Committee of the Senate gaveling in shortly to consider the nomination of Eric Fanning to be the next Army Secretary. He would replace John McHugh, who stepped down in September. He stepped down in October. Eric Fanning was nominated in September of last year and had been serving as acting secretary. And as the Hill writes, the Armed Services Committee Chairman John McCain had told reporters that he raised some concerns with the administration that Mr. Fanning, serving as acting secretary without being confirmed, violated the Vacancies Act. And so they're holding this hearing this morning, the confirmation hearing. Mr. Fanning, Eric Fanning, would be the first openly gay service secretary if confirmed. He had been formerly chief of staff for Ashton Carter, and again this morning being considered by the Armed Services Committee to be the next Secretary of the Army. Should get underway shortly.
Is that what you want?
I told him I was going to tell you.
Where are you?
How are you? Good to see you. Hi, how are you?
We'll make sure I don't forget that. Okay, okay.
Yes.
Well, good morning. Before I begin my statement, I'd like to note it's been reported that the White House has authorized the Department of Defense to target ISIL in Afghanistan, the first such authorization beyond Iraq and Syria. Many of us may be interested to know that we are confined our attacks on ISIL to Iraq and Syria. Now the administration seems to be waking up the fact that more than a year into the U.S. military campaign, ISIL's reach is global and growing. We can only hope it won't take so long for the administration to realize that conditions on the ground in Afghanistan simply don't warrant a dangerous calendar-driven withdrawal of U.S. forces. The Senate Armed Services Committee meets this morning to consider the nomination of Eric Fannin to be Secretary of the Army. We understand that your mother, Kathy, is joining us this morning. As is our tradition, Mr. Fanning, we hope you will take the opportunity to introduce her and any other family and friends joining you today. The United States Army is at war. Tested by 15 years of war, the Army is confronting growing threats and increasing operational demands with shrinking and less ready forces and aging equipment. By the end of the next fiscal year, the Army will be cut down to 450,000 active duty personnel soldiers, down from a wartime peak of 570,000. These budget-driven force reductions were decided before the rise of ISIL or Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And if mindless sequestration cuts are allowed to return, the Army will shrink to 420,000 troops, increasing the risk that in a crisis we will have too few soldiers who could enter a fight without proper training or equipment. Readiness must be the first priority of the Army. As global instability increases, the Army must be able to maintain an uncommitted force and readiness to respond to unforeseen contingencies. As our Army shrinks, readiness suffers. Just over one-third of the Army's brigade combat teams, just over one-third of the Army's brigade combat teams are ready for deployment and decisive operations. Meanwhile, the Army is woefully behind on modernization. The Army must modernize for the harsh realities of 21st century warfare. Our soldiers must be trained and equipped for an increasingly diverse and complex range of threats. They must be able to win against peers in highly lethal combined arms maneuver, near peers in hybrid warfare conditions, and determined unconventional insurgents. Yet our Army is essentially organized and equipped as it was in the 1980s. The main difference is that it is smaller. In fact, many key enabling forces like artillery, armored cavalry, and engineers have been reduced to levels that compromise the Army's ability to field campaign-quality forces. Part of that is the legacy of the Army's acquisition record, which Secretary McHugh has said is, quote, too often a tale of failure, too many underperforming or canceled programs, too few successful fieldings of developmental designs, and far too many taxpayer dollars wasted. That is from your predecessor, Mr. Fanning, Secretary McHugh. The Army must learn the lessons of the failed acquisition programs of recent years. Together with the experience of more than a decade of war, these lessons must guide critical acquisition programs, including the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle and the Armored Multi-Purpose Vehicle. New acquisition authorities passed into law in the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2016 open opportunities for both the Secretary and Chief of Staff to lead positive change. It won't be easy, but it's been done before. Army leaders like General Abrams transformed the Army before. They restored the discipline and morale of the force in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. They transitioned the Army to an all-volunteer force while revolutionizing training doctrine. And they built an Army that won the Cold War and removed Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. We need this kind of transformation again today. I am deeply concerned about the dangerous choice we are forcing upon our Army. The increasing velocity of instability combined with continued reduction in defense spending, will inevitably lead to depleted readiness, chronic modernization problems, and deteriorating morale. These are just some of the major challenges the United States Army faces. One Army Secretary will not tackle them alone. Mr. Fanning, if confirmed, you will take office with less than a year remaining in this administration. Some may question what you can realistically hope to achieve, but as you have been patient waiting for this day to testify on your nomination, I challenge you to be impatient if confirmed as Secretary. Our nation's soldiers do not need a Secretary to mark time. They need a strong Secretary that recognizes there's much to be done and not a minute to be wasted. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in welcoming Mr. Fanning. And I thank you for holding this hearing to fill the critical position of Secretary of the Army. I'd also like to thank Mr. Fanning for his willingness to serve in this position of great responsibility. And it is my understanding, as the Chairman has indicated, that your mother, Kathy, is in the audience this morning, and I welcome her to the hearing also. Mr. Fanning has a wealth of experience having served in senior-level positions throughout the Department of Defense. His previous positions include serving as the acting Undersecretary of the Army, where he was responsible for issues related to the daily management and operation of the Army. Prior to that position, Mr. Fanning was confirmed as the Undersecretary of the Air Force, and he oversaw the Air Force's annual budget and served as the Chief Management Officer. Finally, Mr. Fanning has served as the Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy and played an integral role in the Navy's business transformation efforts. And Mr. Fanning, if you are confirmed as the next Secretary of the Army, your experience during your tenure in the Department will be critical in order to lead the Army during a very critical time when it faces a multitude of challenges. As you know, the Army continues to draw down its end strength with a final goal of 450,000 in the active Army, 335,000 in the Army National Guard, and 195,000 in the Army Reserve. In addition, I would welcome your comments in your testimony on whether the U.S. can continue to meet the commitments overseas with this smaller Army. At the same time, the Army must also contend with how to modernize the force to increase readiness levels. As you are aware, the Army Modernization Program has been challenged. Many programs have been truncated or canceled. And, Mr. Fanning, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on how the Army can make targeted investments in modernization, as well as your views on how the Army can improve its acquisition process. Finally, I welcome Secretary Carter's decision to open all military positions to service by women. With respect to the Army, it is my understanding that neither General Miley nor Secretary McHugh requested an exception to policy to keep any position within the Army closed. As General Milley, testified last July during his confirmation hearing, there is no doubt that women can engage in ground combat with the enemies of our nation because they have been doing it for 10 years, and I strongly agree with those comments. Since that hearing, 3 women have graduated from the United States Army Ranger School, which is the premier training school for Army combat armed soldiers and officers. And according to Army statistics, between FY10 and FY14, the graduation rate at Ranger School was only 42%. So this is another example of the significance of this accomplishment. And all of those people prior to these individuals were men. These 3 women represent the Army of today and the Army of the future, and I look forward to the full integration of women into all of the roles in the United States Army. And again, Mr. Fanning, we look forward to your proposals, your plans, your ideas to continue to lead and serve the Army. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Fanning, it's a custom of the committee to ask several standard questions, and so I will begin them now and appreciate your answers. In order to exercise its legislative and oversight responsibilities, important this committee and other appropriate committees of the Congress are able to receive testimony, briefings, and other communications of information. Have you adhered to applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest?
I have.
Have you assumed any duties or undertaken any actions which would appear to presume the outcome of the confirmation process?
No, Mr. Chairman. I was appointed acting secretary, but after you notified the President you thought that was in violation of the law, I did resign the position.
Thank you. For the record, on November 30th, 2015, I notified President Obama by letter that Mr. Fanning's appointment as the acting Secretary of the Army violated the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998. Without objection, a copy of that letter will be included in the record of this hearing. I further note for the record that the Senate and this committee takes with the utmost seriousness the Senate's constitutional responsibility to provide advice and consent on presidential nominations. That important constitutional requirement is fundamental to the separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branches. I've often said that elections have consequences and presidents are entitled to consideration of their nominations. However, until the Senate gives its advice and consent and until a nomination is confirmed by the full Senate, no president and no nominee may conduct themselves in a way that would presume confirmation. Each administration issues guidance to nominees on the actions they must avoid to presume confirmation. If followed, that guidance allows nominees to prepare for the important duties and responsibilities that they will undertake if confirmed by the Senate. Nominees disregard that guidance at the peril of presuming confirmation. Senator Reid, do you have any comment on that?
I do not, sir.
Thank you. As Mr. Fanning indicated, he has now resigned from his position and is no longer serving in the acting capacity. In my opinion, his resignation has cured the President's violation of the law. Therefore, I believe this committee is prepared to continue consideration of his nomination. Will you ensure that your staff complies with deadlines established for requested communications, including questions for the record and hearings?
I will.
Will you cooperate in providing witnesses and briefers in response to congressional requests?
I will.
Will those witnesses be protected from reprisal for their testimony or briefings?
They will.
Do you agree, if confirmed, to appear and testify upon request before this committee?
I do.
Do you agree to provide documents, including copies of electronic forms of communication in a timely manner when requested by a duly constituted committee, or to consult with a committee regarding the basis for any good faith delay or denial in providing such documents?
I do.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Reid, members of the committee, it is an honor to appear before you today. I'd like to thank President Obama for nominating me and the Secretary of Defense for supporting this opportunity to serve. If confirmed, I look forward to working with them and with Congress. My mother, Kathy Fanning, is here today from Florida. She was unable to attend my previous confirmation hearing 3 years ago, but not even the threat of record-breaking snow was going to stop her this time. Nobody gets the opportunity to serve.
Could we welcome Ms. Fanning? And I hope, like my mother, who is 104 years old, would provide you will provide Secretary Fanning with the same advice and counsel that I received from my mother. Thank you.
Certainly no shortage of advice and counsel. I see also that my goddaughter, Caroline Kassir, and her mother, Allison, have joined us as well. Welcome.
Welcome.
Nobody gets the opportunity to serve in positions like this without the help of many people over a very long period of time. This is particularly true for me. I am fortunate to have many of them in this room with me today, and I will always be grateful for their support. I come from a family with a long history of service in uniform. 2 uncles graduated from West Point and made a career of the Army. A 3rd uncle served a career in the Air Force. A cousin flew helicopters for the Marine Corps, and another cousin was an Army Ranger. I learned from an early age the importance of service and developed a deep respect and admiration for the sacrifices of those in uniform and their families. I have now had the privilege to work in all 3 military departments with all 4 services, as well as in the Office of the Secretary of Defense over the course of 2 administrations, all after starting my career 25 years ago as a research assistant on the House Armed Services Committee. I have seen the Army from every seat at the table, including the Army's. I was Deputy Chief Management Officer of the Navy Department and Chief Management Officer of the Air Force and the Army. I have worked on efficiencies and transformation in every part of the Department of Defense and look forward, if confirmed, to working with this committee as it explores the next round of defense reforms. The Army is a force viewed by too many as just a number, its end strength. Few understand the complexity of ground warfare like this committee does, or how long it takes to build an army with the overmatch necessary to win decisively and with as few casualties as possible. It takes a generation to build an army. It's not just the privates, but the senior enlisted who lead them. And few understand the many missions of the Army. In addition to fighting and winning wars, the Army deters enemies, assures allies, builds partner capacity, enables the joint fight through foundational capabilities, and responds to national emergencies like we see today with flooding and severe weather. The Army's greatest strength is, of course, its soldiers. Over 1 million of them in the active, Guard, and Reserve. There are more than 140,000 of them currently serving in over 140 countries outside the United States. Today, they are exercising with allies in Eastern Europe to deter Russian aggression, training, enabling, and fighting against ISIS and other terrorists around the world, building partnership capacity across the Pacific. If confirmed, these soldiers will be my highest priority, specifically making sure they are ready, which means ensuring they are resilient, fully trained, and properly equipped. To do that, we must create an environment where everyone can flourish, rid of the scourge of sexual assault and suicide. While soldiers are deployed, they must have confidence we will take care of their families. They must also know that we will take care of them when they come home and ease their transition should they choose to leave the Army. And we must make the same commitment to the future force by investing now so that we have the right capabilities for them when they are needed. I have been immensely proud during my first 6 years in this administration to work alongside the men and women of the Navy, Marine Corps, and the Air Force. And if confirmed, I very much look forward to becoming a part of the Army family. It would be my honor to play a role in making sure that the best men and women our country has to offer get all of the support they need in undertaking the mission of defending our country, a mission for which they freely volunteer. We ask them to do extraordinary things. We owe them no less. Thank you again for considering my nomination. Thank you for your service, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fanning. Pause a moment for business. Since a quorum is now present, I ask the committee to consider a list of 3,178 pending military nominations. All of these nominations have been before the committee the required length of time. Is there a motion to favorably report these 3,178 military nominations to the Senate?
So moved.
Is there a second? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Mr. Fanning, how many roughly Army and other personnel are now in Iraq serving there?
Mr. Chair,
roughly?
I understand the number to be about 4,500.
About 4,500. And is there a status of forces agreement with Iraq on the presence of those troops that you know of?
Not that I know of, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly not one that has been through the Parliament of Iraq. So ostensibly, and you were in the administration at the time, the reason why we couldn't leave a sustaining force behind in Iraq at the time of the withdrawal was because we didn't have a status of forces agreement, so therefore it would be impossible for us to leave a force behind, yet somehow we have now 4,500 uniformed members of the military, and no one seems to be concerned about the fact we don't have a status of forces agreement with the Iraqis. I find that curious. Let me ask you a fundamental question. In Iraq and in Syria and the battle against ISIS, which is now metastasizing, at least to the degree where we are going to have to attack ISIS in Afghanistan, among other places, are we winning?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's too early to tell. We clearly are putting a lot of pressure on ISIS, but they're also showing that they can put pressure on us, and they're not contained. But I do think we're making progress. Recently, open source reporting of 6,400 ISIS fighters killed in the last 3 months. We've disrupted the supply route between Mosul and Raqqa, taking back Sinjar and Ramadi. But a great deal of work needs to be done. I do believe it's a long fight. Do you think we have any plan to take Raqqa? I don't know the specifics of any plan, but we're moving in that direction, applying pressure both outside of Raqqa and outside of Mosul.
But you don't know of any specific plan?
I don't, sir, but I don't think I would in my current capacity.
You work directly for Secretary Carter?
I do.
And you didn't know of any strategy to retake Raqqa there?
Since I've returned to his office, I'm in a different capacity than I was before when I was Chief of Staff, and I'm assigned to special projects, and he's been generous enough to let me focus on this hearing today. So no, I've not been involved with him on any discussions about a plan for Raqqa.
And so therefore you wouldn't have any estimate as to how long it would take before we could retake Mosul?
No, Mr. Chairman, I do not.
You know, in the defense bill we just passed, which I know you're very well aware of, requires a reduction of headquarters staff by 25%, cost savings from overall administrative support by $10 billion over a 5-year period. Committee testimony obviously is staffs are too large and redundant, some going so far to say that the secretarial staff and the military staff should be consolidated into a single service staff. First of all, what do you think about the reductions? And second of all, what do you think about such a fundamental change?
I think first on the reductions, I've seen this now in all parts of the Department of Defense. I've been particularly impressed with how the Army went about it because they really did try to de-layer the organization, increase the span of control for supervisors. I think this is something you never stop working on. Headquarters grow back if you're not applying pressure in the opposite direction. So I think the 25% reduction was a good start. I'd like to see how we rationalize that reduction and where we go further. As to the second part, the question about collapsing the staffs inside the military departments, I think there's a great deal of potential there. Sort of fundamental guiding principles need to be, one, protecting civilian control of the military, but two, also making sure the chiefs have the support and resource they need to give independent military advice. But I think if we keep cutting the headquarters in the form that they currently exist in, we're just going to have weaker product delivered later. I think we need to have some reform as the next round, and I think there's enormous potential there, not just in the military departments, but between the military departments and OSD, within OSD, and then further out into the headquarters in the field.
Well, I thank you for that, and you are uniquely situated now to play a key role, and I agree with you. Just flat-out reductions is just the first step. You have to, it's a little bit like sequestration in that it's a meat axe when we need a scalpel. And so I would look forward to having you play a role there, given your unique background. Finally, the source of great frustration, this committee, all of us members, is this continued cost overruns on weapon systems. We've made some reforms. We're putting the service chiefs more involved. You are aware, but it still seems to go on. And every time we really need something, we use that expedited process, which we used for the MRAP and we used for others. So I hope that you will make that one of your top priorities. We can't justify eliminating sequestration and increasing defense spending, which the majority of the members of this committee on both sides feel is necessary given the nature of the events in the world today. But it's hard for us to go back to our constituents when we have a $2 billion cost overrun on an aircraft carrier. And numerous Army programs that spent billions and then never became realities, going all the way back to the future combat systems, to the presidential helicopter. You know, you're very aware of them. We have to stop it. And it's just, if we're going to have credibility with the American people, we cannot have these horror stories, and I'm sure you appreciate it.
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If confirmed, one of the things I'd want to do in the Army is initiate a rapid capabilities office like I worked with very closely in the Air Force. Found it to be in a very effective way for large programs as well, the bombers inside the RCO, the Rapid Capabilities Office in the Air Force. And I think that the reforms in the acquisition reforms in the NDAA will help with this as well. And that's injecting the military departments, the chiefs, in the requirements process, especially as it overlaps with the acquisition process, to help keep costs under control. And that's different than dumping requirements when you already have cost overruns because you can't afford them. It's making wise decisions at the proper times when you have more information to make those trade-offs. So I look forward to implementing those reforms and think it will help us greatly field things faster and avoid the cost overruns that we saw in the past.
Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, Mr. Fanning, thank you for your service to date and your willingness to continue to serve. And given your perspectives in both the Navy and the Air Force, can you just outline what you think the most significant priorities you would bring to the Secretary of the Army's office?
Absolutely. Well, first, I think for the Army, readiness has to be the priority. It's what General Milley said is his priority, and I would agree with him if confirmed 100%, that we need to make sure the soldiers we're sending into harm's way, into combat, are ready, that fully trained, fully equipped. So that would be the first priority. The second, as a part of these efficiencies, is the end result has to be maximizing the combat power of the force structure that we have. And so I think that is a continual culling process to make sure that you're looking across all of your force structure and keeping that tail-to-tooth ratio as strong in the tooth direction as you possibly can. Third, something that I took very seriously and spent a lot of time on in the Air Force is maximizing the idea of one Army, a total force, active, guard, and reserve. We talk a lot about the Army going from 490 to 450, and that's just the active component. We can't do what we're asked to do. The Army can't do what it's asked to do if we just think in terms of an active component. We have to think more creatively going forward about how we operate as a total force. And then fourth, which I mentioned earlier, I would really want to focus on acquisition forms, specifically the stand-up of a Rapid Capabilities Office. The Army has some capabilities where we're seeing, based on what's going on in the ground now in Ukraine and Syria and so forth, that our overmatch is not as great as it should be, as it needs to be, particularly if we don't change the course. And I think specifically about position, navigation, and timing, electronic warfare and cyber, and then survivability of our platforms, particularly aviation. And I see these as three great problem sets that we could launch in a new Rapid Capabilities Office.
As part of your development of a one Army concept, I would presume that you're going to take an active role in engaging the tags,
Absolutely. I spent a lot of time with General Grass in both jobs, and whenever I travel to a state, I always ask if the tag is available to meet, and took the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army out with me, I believe it was in December, it might have been November, to meet with all the tags when they were gathered in Colorado. So I bring a number of relationships with me from the Air Force and plan on increasing that while in the Army, working very closely with the tags and the Council of Governors.
One of the issues, and the Chairman made reference to this quite explicitly, is the new legislation which he guided through last year with respect to the service's role in acquisition. I presume that would be one of your significant priorities in getting the Army fully engaged with their new responsibilities in acquisition. Can you give us some perspective on that?
Absolutely. There are many great professionals, dedicated professionals in OSD, but my experience in having worked now in all three MilDeps and in military departments in OSD, even though we're in the same building, one of the reasons I prefer working in the military department is I feel those who do are much closer to the troops. And I think that's very important in terms of setting and monitoring requirements. What I would say about these new reforms, and I do think putting more responsibility in the military department is the right direction to move, is it is easy for people to conflate the acquisition process and the requirements process. They're fundamentally linked, they overlap, but where I think there's the most potential is that requirements process, getting the requirements right to start, and then at various points in the acquisition process, being able to make those trade-offs. We learn more as we do, particularly if the technology isn't mature, and a good program officer, a program manager should have the opportunity to come back to the Chief of Staff, the Service Secretary, and say, I can get this to you a year faster if you can cut 5% the requirement that you thought you set. I can meet that requirement in a different way. I can save money if we don't chase this. Also that they're smart decisions rather than reactions to when all the green vectors have turned red.
I think one of the other aspects that you suggest in your comments is holding those program officers accountable. And one of the things that I think we've all noticed is that accountability has been so diffuse that these systems sort of have to take a life on their own. No one's really responsible, et cetera. And I would assume that in your development of the new approach that you would have accountability at the forefront in terms of the program managers and others that are under your command. Is that fair?
Absolutely. One of the things that is most intriguing about these changes, it's hard to hold program managers accountable now based on the process, how long they serve, how long the process is. This gives us an opportunity to iterate through the process in ways where we can design more fundamentally transparent metrics that we can hold people accountable to.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator
Thank you, Mr. Fanning. I want to thank you for your service, and it's great to have your mom here. I wanted to ask you about the size of the Army and what your viewpoint is on that. As you know, we are drawing down the end strength of the Army to 450,000 by 2018, and as a result of that, we're actually seeing about a huge number of involuntary separations of people who have served multiple deployments, who have served the country admirably, which to me is to get a pink slip after you've come home, served our country is pretty appalling. But I want to ask you two questions. Number one, do you think that we have the right size Army, and what about the reduction down to 450? And then secondly, when General Milley was before our committee in July, he said that only about 30% of Army brigades are at acceptable levels of combat readiness, and he noted that that number should be between 60 and 70%. So what do you view the biggest readiness problem? Has it improved since July, and where are we?
Okay, I'll start with readiness. It has not improved markedly since July. It's still about a third of our BCTs that are ready. The Army would define as decisive action, ready for a big, large land fight that we might face against Russia or North Korea or what have you. The Army has in plan ways to get there, but there are many impediments in place. The demand on the force, the size that it is, makes it difficult to keep it trained, to keep it going through those training rotations. The friction the Army...
And when you shrink the Army, you get the dwell to deploy ratio is very difficult to meet.
Absolutely, because the demand's not shrinking at the same rate.
So should we be pushing for more resources for a larger Army, given the threats that we face? Is that something that you would advocate for?
I do worry about the size of the Army today. When we were directed to go down to 450 in the active component by the QDR, General Odierno testified that this was with risk. I know he said this quite a bit. I was sitting across the table in the Air Force seat. And General Milley has recently testified we can meet the combatant commander's requirements at 450, but the risk is increasing, and I don't see that vector changing. 2 years ago, when we targeted 450, we didn't have ISIL, we didn't have Russia as provocative as it is. So I am concerned. It's preventing us from doing a number of things we want to do to the Army to make it readier and to keep it whole. I look forward, by the way, I know that you directed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs do a force assessment on the Army specifically by the end of next month, which I think will be very telling.
Good. I look forward to receiving that, and especially as we look at this readiness issue, which is fundamental to the strength of our force and obviously how we treat our men and women in uniform. I think this needs to be a priority for you in this position. I also wanted to follow up on an issue that we have seen in New Hampshire with our Guard, and that's military construction. In fact, in New Hampshire, the condition of our readiness centers in New Hampshire is unacceptable. According to the Army National Guard Readiness Center Transformation Plan, Master Plan, if you look at where we are, we're ranked 51 out of 54 states and territories evaluated nationwide with our infrastructure. In total, the New Hampshire Army National Guard, if you look at our readiness centers, all except one are rated poor or failing. And so, in fact, if you look at our Manchester Readiness Center, it was constructed from 1938 to 1940, doesn't comply with building codes, life, health, safety, or any anti-terrorism force protection standards. So I would ask you in the upcoming budget request, I hope the Army doesn't continue to postpone its request for funding for the New Hampshire Army National Guard vehicle maintenance shops in Hooksett and Rochester, as well as our readiness centers in Pembroke and Concord, because they're just in, we're just in a very deplorable situation. You think about we're 51 out of 54. And I hope, if confirmed, that you'll commit to examining the allocation of military construction dollars, not only between the active and reserve component, but also the allocation among the state Army National Guards to ensure that the Army is prioritizing what our Guard needs, as well. As we know, this is a total force situation. We could not have fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, or what we're doing against ISIS without the Guard.
I absolutely will. And I think we need to take a fundamental look at the total number of dollars as well. This is a place where across all of the military departments where I worked, we take the greatest risk. MILCON, facility sustainment, to the point, because that includes ranges, testing facilities, that it's become in and of itself a readiness issue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Fanning, and your family, and all the support you have. You have quite a resume, sir, and all the experience you've had, which I think can be a tremendous asset for the Army and what you can bring to it, and organizational skills. The thing I would like to ask, and everybody's talking about our force, and I agree with you. I'm as concerned as you are about the reduction of forces. Give me the ratio of forces versus contractors. If adjustments can be made, because we all know, and I would tell you this, and there's not a West Virginia that I know that wouldn't sacrifice so that we'd have the military we have to defend our country. Not one. But they want to make sure you're using your money right. They don't think that we do it as accurate or as efficiently as we could as far as in procurement. They believe that we're sometimes become top-heavy as far as contractors versus reduction of force. And every time somebody comes before us wanting more money, they tell us how they've reduced the forces, but when we check everything else, your command centers are high, all the administration is high, contractors are high, but the people that we actually want to do the fighting force, they're the ones that's critical need. And there's got to be an adjustment. And give me your take on this.
First, I would say that there are tremendous individuals and product that comes out of the contract workforce as an integral part of how we fight and how we mobilize, train, and equip. That said, you know, we lean on the contractor workforce to surge when we need to, and I don't think we do a good enough job of then rationalizing and culling afterwards. It's much like efficiencies. I think the contractor workforce is something that we need to be analyzing continually. It's never.
Can I interrupt you? I'm so sorry, sir, but being a former governor, and there's a few of us here, we know that we were in charge. We were commanders-in-chief of our National Guard. It was our responsibility to do the things that need to be done, and we had to have the support of the governor and the legislature. But we're the ones that led that charge. With that being said, we think there's so much more our Guard could be doing in the role that we're paying high-priced contractors to do. We just think it's ridiculous, the redundancy that we're paying contractors, that we already have a Guard in waiting that's trained, ready to do the job, go to the front line, do whatever. We don't see that correlation or that commitment to using what resources we already have.
I think certainly in General Milley, he's talked about the total force and using the Guard more. If confirmed, as I said, that'll be a priority of mine, and I spent 2 years working that pretty hard in the Air Force. Not only do we need to do it as we draw down, it's the right thing to do to make sure that we're utilizing all the components properly. We're in an interesting position now where we're almost due the National Commission's report on the structure of the Army, and I'm optimistic we'll get some interesting ideas out of that will help push us forward in thinking more of a total force and using the Guard more productively. But going back to the contractor workforce, like I said, that's something we need to rationalize all the time. When I was in the Navy Department, we started something called Contractors Court, where every echelon has to justify its contracts to the next echelon up. And it does an interesting thing, because you would see each echelon strip or cancel a certain percentage of the contract because they knew they couldn't justify it to the boss. And so by the time it got all the way up to the top of the pyramid, you had rationalized that pretty well. We did it in the Air Force to great success. The Army has something similar, but if confirmed to be something that I personally
Can you get a handle? Have you gotten a handle on how many contractors we actually have? I can't get a handle. I can't get anybody to give me an accurate count.
That is the first thing and the most difficult thing, to know how many contracts you have. And of course, we contract for services, so we don't always know how many people are behind those contracts.
And the amount of money we're paying.
It's amazingly difficult to figure out what that number is. It's very frustrating.
And as far as procurement, and that seems to be your strong point, what would you do? I mean, the bottom line is every time someone asks you, do we have enough money or enough in force, you're always going to have to say you need more. But on the other hand, if you only had X amount to work with, What can we do here that allows you to be more effective and to be used that, you know, in a more prudent way? I mean, can we untie your hands?
My experience is bureaucracies are additive, and processes are created to prevent the last big bad thing.
What would you change in procurement right now?
I would give more flexibility to the program managers, those people that you're holding accountable, and then hold those people accountable. That includes whoever it is in the leadership positions, but then us inside of the organization, so that we can develop a more, program managers spend the vast majority of their time putting briefing slides together and briefing people, as opposed to actually running their programs. We're not nearly as agile as an institution as our adversaries are now, or even private sector companies that don't want to compete with us because of all the or work with us because of all the barriers we put up for them to do so. And so I would look for ways where we can strip out some of these requirements that slow us down, allow us to be more agile, better tap into innovation, both in terms of technology but also processes, so we can iterate more rapidly than we are now.
Well, let me just say my time's running up, but I think you're uniquely qualified because you're seeing 3 branches of government. Very few people have come to this position, having the background that you've had and administrative skills that you've got. I hope you put them to good use, and I hope we give you the ability to do that, sir. And I hope you use the forces that we have, make sure that our frontline forces are strong and we have the right amount of people to do the job, make sure that we don't have an abundance of contractors that we don't need, overpriced, using our guard more effectively, and building the force that we need to protect our country. And we'll be behind you 1,000%.
Yeah, thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Fanning, for your service and your continued willingness to serve. I have a number of questions, so hopefully you can answer these succinctly. Yes or no will suffice on some of these. So, you and I have talked a lot about what's going on with regard to Russia, the massive Russian buildup in the Arctic, as well as Russia's other numerous provocations over the past few years. And as you know, General Dunford and General Milley testified they saw Russia as the biggest threat to the U.S. Secretary Carter here also testified that he saw the significant strategic importance of the Arctic and how we were late to the game. Admiral Zumkov, the Coast Guard commandant, said we're not even in the game relative to Russia's massive buildup in the Arctic. Do you agree with that? What Secretary Carter and the Coast Guard Admiral said?
I do think that we're not nearly enough in the game in the Arctic as we should be.
Admiral Harris testified here that he saw one of the greatest threats in the Pacific was North Korea. Do you agree with that?
I do.
And we have been supportive in a bipartisan way of the President's rebalance or pivot to the Asia-Pacific. Are you supportive of that strategy?
Yes.
So as you know, last year the Army decided to get rid of the 425 based at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, 5,000 airborne infantry troops, strategic asset for the country, kick-in-the-door capability. 7 to 8 hours can be anywhere in the northern hemisphere, given the strategic lift that we also have at JBER. To General Milley's credit, he's put this decision on hold, reevaluating it, thinking it may have been a strategic mistake. Does the U.S. Army have any other airborne brigade that is trained, equipped, and ready to fight and win in sub-zero mountain climates like those in the Arctic or those in North Korea?
No, not like those. Not like those we have in Alaska.
And the 425 is part of the strategic reserve right now with regard to a contingency in Korea. General Scaparrotti called it the over-the-hill cavalry, could be there in 7 hours. Do you think removing these forces emboldens the already unstable leader of North Korea or Putin in terms of his buildup in the Arctic? When we're removing literally the only airborne BCT trained soldiers in that part of the world?
If confirmed, Senator, I would look for ways to reverse as many of the combat cuts that the Army made last year as possible, to include Alaska.
Let me talk about, just very quickly, we've been supportive of the President's rebalance. As a matter of fact, in the NDA, we had language supporting it, talking about how we shouldn't be cutting forces in the Asia-Pacific. How does cutting the only airborne brigade combat team in the Asia-Pacific support the President's rebalance to the Asia-Pacific?
Well, that's one element of the Army's rebalance to the Pacific. The Army created a four-star leader there.
You think
and
that
increased the number of soldiers and civilians overall that are dedicated to the Pacific? I think the number is 77,000 to over 100,000 today. since 2007.
Let me just, if the Army retained the 425 at its full strength, as you and I have talked about, wouldn't it send a strong message, a strategic message to North Korea, to Russia, and our allies about America's commitment to defend our strategic interests on the Korean Peninsula, in the Arctic, and support our allies? Don't you think that would be a strong message?
I think it would send a strong message. The Army last year had to balance the cuts that it needed to make across all of the requirements and priorities that it has.
Let me get to the 450 number. I believe, and I think a lot of members of this committee think it's low. I think it's way too low, strategically risky for the country. Do you agree with that?
I do believe it's a risk, yes, and that's been testified to by many others as well.
And to his credit, again, and you already touched on it, and I appreciate you mentioning it, General Milley is working hard to balance the tooth-to-tail ratio, as you said earlier, making sure we have much more in the teeth category than the tooth. Of the 450, how many currently have musician MOSs?
In the 450, I believe that number is about 1,500.
How many prisoners are at Fort Leavenworth of the 450?
Of the 450, 1,100 of them are counted as prisoners.
How many soldiers of the 450 are right now out processing?
Combined total of just over 15,000.
So when we talk about the 450, there are literally thousands, tens of thousands, who are not deployable, not capable of fighting, correct?
That is correct.
Does it make sense that the Army is proposing cutting thousands of healthy, deployable airborne infantry soldiers to make room for tens of thousands of non-deployables and non-effective soldiers that are counted as part of the 450?
It would be nice not to count them against the 450, and I don't think people realize what percentage of the 450 active component is not deployable for reasons even greater than you've mentioned. They have medical profiles, or for other legitimate reasons. They're a part of the generating force. They're training now. They are already deployed. So when we say we're heading towards a 450,000 active component in the Army, that's not 450,000 people ready to be deployed.
My time's expired here, but let me get one final commitment, Mr. Fanning, and we've had a lot of discussions, but if confirmed, I need your 110% commitment to ensure that the very last soldiers that we're cutting are the combat-effective, tip-of-the-spear, strategically located infantry soldiers who can fight tonight if they need to, as opposed to so many of the other soldiers that we're talking about. In other words, that you and General Milley would commit to cut the trigger pullers strategically located like the 425 absolutely, positively last relative to any other soldiers you're looking at cutting. Can I get that commitment from you?
You absolutely have that commitment, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fanning, thank you for being here. To your mom, thank you. To the Kassir family, it's wonderful to have you here, your dear friends. And Mr. Fanning, one of the things that we have seen is, again in the third quarter, a big spike in suicides, especially among Guard members. What are your plans to improve mental health services and to make that number go down in the United States Army?
We have seen a spike, and with the sheer size of the Army, the number in absolute terms is large, and it's too large. I think the Army has made some impressive progress increasing access to health care by embedding it at the brigade level so that it's more readily accessible. In terms of care across the board, sexual assault prevention, behavioral health, suicide, I think that's a key component of making access to care as easy as possible for our soldiers. So that's one thing. But I think also a lot more work has to be done fighting the stigma against seeking behavioral health.
One of the other things that's been done in the Israeli Army is, or the Israeli Defense Forces, is they've pushed down to the platoon level that the soldier in charge keeps an eye out for the other members and reports, hey, Tim is getting a little sideways or Kathy's getting a little sideways. Are you looking at any ways to push the decision-making down a little bit lower as to enabling them to have the ability to say, look, maybe we need to help this person?
Absolutely. I think we need to have it down to the lowest level possible, and the Army is actually already looking at this, from my understanding, and has a number of other programs like that. The Senior Master Sergeant of the Army has started something called Not in My Squad to cover a whole range of issues, and a part of that is training people to look for indicators that they should act on and report on.
It really helped reduce the numbers in the IDF. In another area, the Army, you said before that the Army recognizes the tactical importance of the Humvee fleet and the enduring requirement to maintain a relevant and capable fleet. Do you expect the Army will continue to rely on a large Humvee fleet even after the JLTV has been fully fielded?
Absolutely. As I recall, the ultimate end state after they rationalized the requirements for their ground fleet was to maintain about 50,000 Humvees, which also allows them to cull out the newest and best maintained of what they have. So it'll end up being a relatively young and well-maintained fleet, and a sizable one still.
Looking in the Middle East, one of the things that has struck me is we've seen refugees all throughout the world. At the same time that we won't put in a no-fly zone or a safe zone, right in the same country where those refugees are coming from. Do you support the putting in place of a no-fly zone or a safe zone?
I actually haven't studied either of those proposals enough to give you an opinion on them. I'm happy to come back and talk to you. I do think we haven't done enough collectively to prevent the crisis and now deal with the crisis, which is unlike any refugee crisis that I've seen.
Well, you're going to be working with the Department of Defense. You're going to be working with the Secretary of Defense. And this is a critical issue to all of us, and we need you to provide the unvarnished truth of your opinion to him. And you know, I'm wondering, are you going to look into this and start to put this information together and come to some conclusions on this?
I will, Senator. As you know, the Service Secretary's responsibility is to make sure that we have the forces that are ready and trained for whatever they're asked to do, including if it's a no-fly zone or a safe zone.
I do, but I am also hopeful that you know, if Secretary Carter asks you, that you say, look, here's why I think it makes sense or why it doesn't make sense. Here's a mission that's critical and important to the success of our nation's future and where this goes.
Absolutely. I commit to you that I certainly will give my unvarnished opinion to Secretary Carter whenever asked.
And on occasion, if not asked, if you see something a little sideways, will you take him aside privately and say to him, look, here's my view of this?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Fanning, you have served this nation well and with distinction. We appreciate everything you've done for our country, and thank you for being here today. Thank you, Mr.
Senator.
Chairman.
Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Fanning. I would like to begin by thanking Senator Sullivan for bringing to your attention some questions and comments that he has about our concern that we have with Russia, especially in the Arctic. I think many times we don't focus on that because of the truly large challenges that we see all around this world, but I do appreciate his comments, and I do share his concerns that he has about the 425. So I thank you for your commitments that you made to him. I know one of your main challenges is going to be to balance that investment made against future threats alongside the demands that we now face with readiness and modernization and force structure. And you've said that your top priority is readiness. You noted to me when we met last month the need for more investment in facilities sustainment. How do you plan to prioritize all those remaining demands if we're going to be able to address needs in the future and be able to balance those? I want to see what your thought process is on that.
Sure, Senator. I think we take risk in all parts of our budget right now. And what I look at, having seen this happen incrementally, and part of it is just the uncertain fiscal environment that we've been planning in, is looking, and sometimes we lose sight of the aggregate risk. And that's really what I'm trying to get at now, and if confirmed, would do so in the Army. And one of those places, and it's not unique to the Army, where we have taken an aggregate risk that I think a lot of people haven't fully realized yet is in MILCON and facility sustainment. And so we need, it really is becoming, in my view, a fundamental readiness issue for all of the services. As I said earlier, ranges are a part of that. And we need to make sure that we're not mortgaging our future with the decisions we're making now. But all that means is we'd be moving risk to another part of the budget. But we have taken year after year after year of layered risk in facility sustainment, and it concerns me greatly. The first visit I made in the Army was to Fort Bragg, and that's a critical, very busy base. And it just, from the minute that I landed, I could tell this base looks tired. And so we have to look into that very seriously.
You know, as members of this committee, we're hearing a number of predictions and ideas about what the future is going to look like. Do you see any kind of major shift on the horizon for the Army, and what the Army will do, how it will operate, what it will need in the future?
I think Secretary Gates always said we have a perfect record at predicting the future. We get it wrong every time. I think he was talking about the future kind of war we'll have. What I try to do, and if confirmed, we'll try to do in the Army, is less predict what that future is than take advantage of some of the reforms we're talking about to make the Army more agile at getting new capabilities out to the field. I think we're losing the competitive edge we have at iterating against our adversaries, either in how to use technology, which is a big part of it. We got to empower soldiers in the field with the tools that we already have and how to use them differently, but how to incorporate new ideas and new technology faster into what we do produce and what we do field.
Are there resources or specific equipment that the Army now has that you believe is outdated and should be replaced? Do you have a list of what needs to be ended in order to move forward in the future for what you really are going to need?
Well, I don't know that in the current state there are a lot of things I would say we could end because we're reliant on them all, and a lot of the platforms are old, but have lots of new technology and capability on them. You sort of think three phases to procurement, which is modernizing what you have now, recapitalizing it with the next generation, and then your science and technology to keep investing in what comes after that. The Army last year, before I went over as acting under, just because of the budget pressures, decided to invest more in modernizing the platforms they have and keep the science and technology for the long-term investment going and taking risk in developing the next generation platforms. That's a concern to me, and if confirmed, that's an area I'd be looking at very closely. Where have we taken too much risk in platforms that we're going to try and hold on too long?
Thank you.
Mr. Fanning, I certainly appreciate your being here today, and I have to say you're one of the most refreshingly candid witnesses I can recall being before this committee, and I want to join Senator Donnelly and really encourage you to carry that quality into your work. You have a great deal of experience, a great deal of knowledge, and I've learned today a great deal of wisdom on these issues. Share it. Don't be hesitant. And even if it might cause some friction, that's your value to the United States, and I hope you will maximize the input that you have, because I believe you have a lot to contribute.
Thank you.
There's been a theme in our discussions today, and it occurs to me what bothers me is that what we're talking about is turning one of those expensive aircraft carriers. And we make strategic decisions that have long-term implications and even long-term implementation based upon assumptions that turn out to not be very good. I was in Iceland recently, and if there's a strategic spot on this planet, it's Iceland, right in the North Atlantic. And yet, because we thought the Cold War was over, we closed the air base at Keflavik. I think that was a tremendous strategic mistake. In retrospect, because the world has changed, and now suddenly we're in competition with Russia again, and I use the word competition advisedly. The Army size that we've been talking about today, the assumptions upon which that decision was made were valid when they were made, but they're no longer valid. And I share my colleagues' concern that we are facing a new round of challenges around the world, and we really have to revisit that decision. I'm not so convinced as some of my colleagues about the danger of contractors because of the cost of training and the high level of training that our Army and our tooth, if you will, we ought to be using contractors for everything but fighting. We shouldn't be having somebody that costs $1 million or $500,000 to train to do work that contractors can do. So I think that's something that has to be constantly evaluated. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. I think the contract workforce is an important, an integral part of the workforce, with the civilian workforce and the uniformed force. The challenge is getting the balance right and making sure, in my view, the contract workforce provides invaluable services to the Department of Defense and is a place you can go to when you need to surge.
And it makes sense to do that rather than use trained Army personnel, uniformed force, to do things that aren't warfighting.
Absolutely. The challenge is, and it's something we have to keep on all the time, making sure we've got those three components properly balanced. The one that grows the fastest, if not properly overseen, can be the contractor workforce because of how many different ways it can grow. So that's one we have to watch closely.
That's a management challenge.
It is a management challenge. But I would never suggest, and I hope I haven't, that they aren't a very valued and important part of how we get things done. Some things are best done in the contract workforce because it's something, it's an expertise you don't need organically and want to pay for, or it's a surge capability. Some things you want in your civilian workforce, and others you want a uniformed person to do.
I do think that we need to talk about the Army, the end strength, and have a review of that, and I hope that is something that you will initiate. The third area where we're talking about having made strategic decisions that now appear imprudent because of changed assumptions is the Arctic, as Senator Sullivan has emphasized. Huge activity by the Russians in terms of their military buildup, and the idea of depopulating or diminishing our force availability in that region, it seems to me, again, given changed assumptions, may have made good sense 2 years, 5 years ago. I'm not sure it makes sense today, and we have to continue to reassess these decisions and be flexible in responding to the current realities. The final one that the chairman talked about is Afghanistan. We have to assess what's going on the ground as opposed to saying we're going to make certain decisions based upon the calendar or 2-year-old assumptions. And I think all of those are examples of this importance of flexibility and constant reassessment of what the realities on the ground are. Do you share that sort of overall concern?
Absolutely, Senator. We like to say we're a learning organization, and that doesn't mean much if we're not willing to make changes based on what we've learned. And as regards the Arctic and Alaska in particular, when I became acting Secretary of the Air Force about 2 years ago, one of the first things I did was reverse an Air Force decision to move a squadron of aggressors of fighter jets out of Alaska because of the strategic importance there, because of the range space we had there, because of the proximity, not just to adversaries or potential adversaries in the Pacific, but proximity to our partners in terms of training and so forth. So I've had a particular interest in that region for a long time.
And finally, I noted in your testimony several times you used the words agile and mobile. You remind me of a high school football coach who used to say he wanted us to be agile, mobile, and hostile. I appreciate your testimony, Mr. Fanning, and I appreciate your service to this country. Thank you,
Senator.
No longer possible for the senator. Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Fanning, for being here today and for your service in so many different capacities throughout our various departments. I want to thank your mother for joining us today as well. Thank you, Kathy, for being here. As you know, Mr. Fanning, last month Secretary Carter announced that all military occupational specialties will be open to women. I do support providing women with various opportunities to serve in any capacity, as long as we are not lowering standards to allow participation and that we're not decreasing our combat effectiveness. So in order to ensure that women are fully integrated into these previously closed positions, I believe the implementation strategy must be thoroughly and fully developed to include having an understanding of those secondary and tertiary effects so that we're not setting our women or our men up for failure. Over the past few weeks, I've had the opportunity to visit with a number of soldiers and Marines. I've visited Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as well as Marine Base Quantico in Virginia. And during my trip to Fort Bragg, I was able to sit down with a number of special operators and airborne paratroopers from the 82nd to discuss the gender integration. And I did the same at Quantico. Both of these groups were mostly senior-level NCOs, some more junior and non-commissioned officers, and, of course, some junior officers, and both men and women, and really talked about gender integration. Have you had the opportunity to go out and talk through gender integration with soldiers, and are you committed to doing that if you have not?
I have, and I've been to Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, Fort Hood. Spent a lot of time at Benning in particular discussing this issue down at Ranger School, and if confirmed, it'd be a dialogue I would continue to have, because I share your view that we need to get this right. It's critical that we get this right.
Absolutely, and I think we have to, again, make sure that we are planning wisely and that we're understanding what any follow-on effects will be, whether it's positive or whether it is negative as well. One of the top concerns that I heard about the implementation is that it shouldn't be done haphazardly. And we have seen this recently with short terms of getting plans turned in and short turnaround for implementation. And I'm directing those comments at the Marines. But we want to make sure that the Army does it right. We want to make sure everybody does it right. Do you think that having such a quick turnaround of 15 days for a plan to work that out, do you think that's enough time to get it right?
I haven't seen the Marine Corps plan or any guidance they've been given. I will say that I think getting this right means doing it methodically and deliberately and however much time it takes to get it right. And the Army plan, as I saw it before I left, is just that. It is a long-term plan that I think is carefully thought through, starting with validated requirements for an infantryman, for example. What requirements do you need to meet to do the job of infantryman? And if you can meet the requirements, then we start from there. But I don't believe in the Army plan, and all the plans are with the Secretary of Defense for review. You're going to see anything that looks like a rush to judgment.
I am very hopeful of that.
That would set us back, set back the opportunities for women and take us more time in the end.
Yes, and I agree with that. We do have to be very methodical and talk about the implications of the standards and what that might do to orders of merit lists and promotion opportunities. Are we setting our women back or moving them forward? We don't know what those implications are yet. So I appreciate your thoughtful approach to that. Do you believe that women, now that we've opened up those areas, combat, do you believe that women should be required to register for the Selective Service?
Senator, I think that's something that the administration has taken up and is looking for a recommendation for Secretary Carter, so I can't get out front of him. I would say if we're focused on equal opportunity, I think a part of that is equal responsibility.
Okay, thank you. I do appreciate your thoughtful manner as we work with our soldiers in the Army. I also want to echo, I know Senator Sullivan had spoke earlier about the 425, and we want to make sure that we are protecting our assets in the Pacific Northwest. That is of great concern. Many of us have talked that through, and so I would appreciate your consideration with that as well. Thank you, Ranking Member Reed, and thank you, Mr. Fanning.
Thank you, Senator. On behalf of Chairman McCain, let me recognize Senator Heinrich.
I want to thank the ranking member and thank you, Mr. Fanning. Welcome back. And I want to say I really appreciate your willingness to serve. You have served this country in many different roles. And in particular, I want to thank you for the work that we did together on operationally responsive space. When Senator King was talking about the ability to reevaluate information and change directions, that's a skill that is often lost on people in this town, and I think you have it, and I appreciate that very deeply. In last year's NDAA, this committee expressed its concern about the lack of investment and sustainment of major range and test facility bases. And the committee noted that some test ranges, and I know I've mentioned White Sands Missile Range to you, but there are others, have not received a MILCON project in direct support of test and evaluation in over a decade now. And the committee therefore urged the department to complete its comprehensive assessment of test range only MILCON needs and investments. And I wanted to ask you if you know what the status of this comprehensive assessment is at this time.
If I understand correctly, I think the assessment is, the draft assessment is done and it's now in coordination. I haven't seen anything yet, but I share your concern on that. I saw it acutely in the Air Force, and that's why I mentioned this as a readiness issue. Not investing in the ranges and the testing facilities means that we can't replicate real-world scenarios, and it becomes ineffective training, ineffective testing. Doesn't tell us much.
Do you have thoughts on what metrics you'll use, if confirmed, to assess the quality and the capability of the Army's test and evaluation infrastructure in particular?
I think two fundamental metrics. First, I'd probably start with the end user to see what they got from the range, what they didn't get from the range to the facility. But I think if we're focused on investments in the facilities, a series of metrics would be how often the facilities are actually available for what we need them to be.
Great. Switching gears a little bit, Mr. Fanning, morale, welfare, and recreation programs are a key component to soldier retention and quality of life. And as you noted in your advance policy questions, it is important to continue providing high-quality MWR programs and to sustain them for the future. And I would say that's even more acutely important in remote and isolated installations. If confirmed, how do you intend to address those challenges in sustaining Army MWR programs, particularly given the current fiscal environment, and in particular at those remote and isolated installations?
I share your commitment to the remote and isolated installations and facilities. I think one of the most important things to do with MWR is to constantly assess what's of value to soldiers and their families. We lay on a lot of programs and we don't ever rationalize them and pull money out of ones that aren't effective to put back into ones that are, and people can't access because we're not investing them enough. And to be on the lookout for how things evolve, how families are evolving, how needs are evolving, to look for new ways that we can provide services in that area.
I think that's particularly important because those needs change, and we need to meet people where they are, especially if we're going to continue to be able to have the kind of people that we want serving at those remote and isolated installations. As a former engineer, I was pleased to see your commitment to expanding and, in particular, outreach programs that foster STEM professionals, and we really need to make sure that we're getting the best and brightest within the Army and all the services with regard to the next generation of scientists and engineers. Can you talk a little bit about how you're going to approach that issue at the Army in particular, and how we make sure that we have a constant structure in place to engage those scientists and engineers early so that we can get them into the services and doing that kind of work?
First, I'd say that I think we need to start by explaining what the civilian workforce is and what it's not. It gets kind of bandied about in the political process, and I think a lot of people assume it's just a large collection of bureaucrats. Our engineers, scientists, are national treasures. That, I think, hit me the most, and probably a lot of other people, a couple, 3 years back when we were furloughing civilians. What was happening to our laboratories, what was happening to our test ranges. Now, these are people who could make a lot more money doing things outside of government, but are committed to the mission. And so I think that's where we can do the most, capturing people earlier, which is finding ways to expose them to the mission and the problem sets that we're on and get them excited for that. But these workforces, as we decrease the civilian workforce, increase the civilian workforce, convert from contractor to civilian, we need to make sure that we're keeping this talent organically that is very hard to recruit and very hard to replace if we lose it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Heinrich. And I've been informed that my colleagues may return from the vote, Mr. Secretary, which gives me the great opportunity to initiate a second round. And let me ask, you bring to this job extraordinary experience in management in the Department of Defense and both in the Department of the Navy and Department of the Air Force. One of the persistent criticisms of Defense, the Department, is that it has not been able to successfully pass an audit. Can you give us some insights as to how you, in the Army, but hopefully influence the Department of Defense across the board, can get DOD on the track to a successful audit?
I think, first of all, for success to take place in this area, it needs constant senior leadership development. We got a tremendous shot in the arm from Secretary Panetta, who understood this better probably than most. So that's the first thing. It's just the commitment, if confirmed, that I'll make to this process. I think as regards the Army, there are probably 2 things. I've seen it now in each of the military departments, and it's different in each service, what the strengths and weaknesses are and what their way forwards are. I've long been a proponent of learning from doing. You know, we'd gotten to a point across all of the military services, I think, where we had prepped enough and it was time to start testing what we had done. And we're actually learning a lot from that. In 14, just now in 15, the Army had an auditor that put down its pen. So we didn't complete the audit. The Army didn't complete the audit or get a favorable opinion at the end. But we're learning 2 things. We're not only learning where we have weaknesses that we need to put more emphasis, we're learning where we have made enough improvements that we can pull resource off of that. And so finding the resource to put on the areas we have problems. So in the Army, the first thing is creating a series of work schedules based on those problems and sticking to it and holding people accountable. The second, and this applies to all the military departments, but maybe even more so to the Army is fortunate in that some of its ERP systems are actually more robust and are fielded, and is making sure that you shut down the legacy systems when you're supposed to, because those legacy systems aren't audit compliant. And so you need to force the service, the workforce, into the new systems that are audit compliant. So that'd be the 2 areas I think I'd probably focus on the most.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I noticed that my colleague, Senator Graham, has arrived, and let me forego further questions in a second round so he may have a first opportunity. Senator Graham.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Thank you very much. Have you been following the media reports that there may be consideration at the Pentagon to reduce, to take a star away from General Petraeus?
I have.
What's your view of that?
I shared Secretary McHugh's view that no further action was necessary regarding General Petraeus. I was his acting under when he was the Secretary of the Army.
I just want to say for the record, Senator Reid, that I hope there's bipartisanship for this approach. Number one, that's a great answer. I think General Petraeus, like everyone else who's been fighting this war, only God knows how many years he was deployed since 9/11. He made a mistake. He took responsibility for it. And his military record, I think, stands as one of the greatest in recent memory. And I would just urge the Secretary of Defense to follow your recommendation and not go down this path. As to the Army itself, I know you've been asked about force structure. What does it mean to have 490,000 members of the Army versus 420 in terms of things you can do? What's the difference? I know you got 70,000 more people, but what does it mean in terms of engagement?
Well, I think when you look at, so 490 down to 450 in the current construct, down to 420 as a possible number in sequestration. We testified, General Odierno testified when we first, well, the Army was first targeted on the 450 number, that it would be, there would be great risk. General Milley has testified the same thing. The risk has increased. The number hasn't changed for our end strength, but the risk has increased. Going down to 420 sequestered environment, I think, would require a whole new set of assumptions and guidance on what the Army is supposed to do and what its priorities should be. Everyone has testified, and I'll do it here today, that we couldn't do, even as a total force, not just the active component, what we're being asked to do if we went down to what sequestration would force us to do.
President Obama, in his State of the Union address, called for the Congress to give him an authorization to use military force against ISIL. I think that's an absolutely reasonable request. Do you agree that it would be good if the Congress would do it?
I do.
Now, you're about to be Secretary of the Army. I think you're well qualified. From an Army perspective, would you like to see limitations on time when it comes to fighting ISIL?
I think my preference would be not to have a limitation.
Okay, I think that makes perfect sense. If I'm in the Army, I don't want to tell the enemy after 3 years we're going to have to stop and start all over again. So, one, that makes sense to me that from an Army perspective, I think from a national perspective, we shouldn't have a limitation on time. What about geography? Should we limit it to geography?
I think we should fight them wherever they are.
They're in Afghanistan today. I want to applaud the administration for allowing our military to go after ISIL as if they were al-Qaeda. I think that's a responsible deal. Means. Is there any means you want to take off the table?
No.
Thank you. I look forward to voting for you for Secretary of the Army.
Thank you, Senator.
I don't think I can top that. So let me just say, the staff has indicated that there are no more of my colleagues that are returning. And let me thank you, Mr. Fanning, for your service to the nation. And on behalf of Chairman McCain, adjourn the hearing. The hearing's adjourned.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Have you been? Good to see you.
How you doing, man? with boxer, you know. So we're just down here with her. She stepped in the bathroom. Okay. Why not you? Yeah, likewise. What's your Manchester?
Did you see that I sent you the list for the guy who did it? So you can be like, here, email, send. I scanned it. You didn't read my message. You didn't put it together. That was the scanned copy of the picture. One of the best things, Yeah, okay.
We got our very welcome.
We'll take care of you. Probably not a bad idea.
There's no rental cars anyway.
Eric Fanning, there on the right of your screen, nominated to be the next Army Secretary, former Chief of Staff to Ashton Carter. If approved by the Armed Services Committee, he'd get a vote in the full Senate, although, as Christina Marcos from The Hill reports, Senator Pat Roberts of Kansas has vowed to block the Fanning nomination over President Obama's plan to transfer Guantanamo detainees to a U.S. location. The Armed Services Committee still has to vote on the nomination of Eric Fanning.
That's the mistake everybody makes.
Hey, Larry. Larry.
Do we know or can you confirm who that is?
That right? Oh, no. Just counts.
Well, right now I'm in the Senate liaison. I'm also actually working
And so for that,
I'll do a forthcoming session.
Eric Fanning on your screen, nominated to be the next Army Secretary. Former Secretary John McHugh retiring in October. President Obama nominating Eric Fanning in September. The hearing gaveling out just a bit earlier than expected as votes are underway. A vote is underway, actually just wrapped up on the Senate floor as they failed to move forward on the override of the presidential veto of the disapproval resolution on the interstate waters bill. The Senate failing to move forward on that just moments ago.
Stay right here.
You want me to call out? Bring up through your Okay, all right, I'll go grab it.
Yes, sir. I'll get him.
Thank you, Joe.
See, they copied me on that.
Oh.
Oh, you sure you don't want to stick around? Maybe we'll find some other senators. Can we do another round for you?
Yeah, Western is good. She's good there. Because when you never said it was a candidate, which is a
You know, I think it's threaded the needle on those as well as anyone has in some of the challenging questions. So I think about it very well.
One benefit. Get one hold column. Got 11 months. What do you got? Well done.
Okay. All right, cheers.
Oh.
He was well prepared.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
You've done better.
All right, well,
Thank you so much.
Reaching out to them to try and ask.
Sir, good work.
Focus to another nominee and another. Awesome.
Not receiving that. Secretary. Secretary. Melissa. Okay, sir. Where we are. I just want to picture you know, like play with your hair the whole time, right?
Wednesday, and I come back Friday.
I was like, just too late.
You've already got it. Sorry. You let Joe's all sorry.
Apparently this is a group of people that hang out together. Their daughter, goddaughter, they're still back in the corner. She's doing something.
not certain.
Last time you saw
Where did you serve? In the Philippines. My grandfather.
Okay.
Problem with it? Unfortunately, funds probably let you go. We should have kept you in.
Last day of business on the in the Senate today, including in the committees, as the Senate Armed Services Committee wraps up. The Senate itself, meanwhile, failed to override President Obama's veto of a resolution that would block a clean water regulation handed down by the EPA. Washington Examiner writes that the EPA says the waters of the U.S. rule would protect streams and wetlands that affect water quality, and more precisely define waters protected by the Clean Water Act, but ranchers and farmers and states disagree. They also say that both the House and Senate passed a resolution to block the rule, but President Obama vetoed the measure on Tuesday night, and the Senate 52-40. They needed 60 to move forward. They failed to move forward on the president's veto. And that pretty much will wrap up work in the Senate. They'll gavel out before too long this morning as the nation's capital and much of the East Coast under the threat of a major blizzard this weekend beginning Friday afternoon.
Thank you for your experience.
For you, somebody.
Job? Yeah. You mock my substance.
Tony, tell me everything.
I'm just not a shovel.
Tony, Ellis,
Yes, yes. Remain as well known to the Secretary pretty well. Oh, we have a large community in Hawaii, as you know. We have a few remaining.
Okay, I can understand and sympathize completely. I wouldn't want to talk to me either.
How are you, Eric? Honored to meet you.
Congratulations
Thank
on
you.
your would-be Secretary of the Army.
Thank you very much. Honored to meet you.
I'm Celestino Ormeda, 98-year-old veteran of World War II and factory man.
Where do you live?
In the Philippines.
In the Philippines? What brings you to Washington?
The new healthcare dentist. And we would like to have an appointment with you sometime next week, if possible.
Next week? Yeah. I won't be the Secretary of the Army by next week. Maybe. How long are you here for?
Yes,
He lives in Maryland.
Oh, you live in Maryland. Okay. So do you have contact
Yes, sir.
information?
I will
Okay.
make sure
If
that we're all set
it takes
up.
them a while to confirm you after the hearing. So.
And this is your synopsis of who and what I am.
That's fantastic.
We'd like to have an appointment with you sometime when you are Secretary of the Army.
Great. Thank you for coming out today.
And I'm hoping you will be.
Me too. Thank you. Honored to meet you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
All right.
Did you yes, background on this issue. Okay. You want oh, sure. Yes, yes, sir. We'll see you later. Thank you.
I am so happy.
This is my card. I live a few blocks away from here. Sure. I will always send you an email. Very good. Thank you so much. Your last name, sir? Crook. C-R-O-O-K. Very good. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I know. Fine. We're gonna go to the left. No, not right.
You want me to take it for you?
Yes.
That's
Here you
it.
go.
Selfies, please.
Hey. They both go there.
Stay there, just like everybody on the background. There you go.
Thank you.
Last one should be best.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm so happy for you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.
It's nice to meet you.
Sonny, how are you? Good to see you.
I got it.
Oh, you got it. Okay. Thanks, Scott.
Okay, so I'll let her know. I was gonna call. Okay.
I think they can speak to a little bit.
I couldn't imagine, yeah. Good
Now that
answer on
you're-
the ERP. I didn't know. The Pentagon IG director spoke this morning on the budget, on the state budgetary. You should
Yeah.
take a look at it.
I can't believe I missed that one. Yeah, usually get up early and read all the press.
Yeah.
All right.
No, you come out with a lot.
Thanks, Tony. Good to see you.
Hi. Okay.
Thank you. All right.
And during Eric Fanning's hearing today, he's nominated for Secretary of the Army. Both the chairman, John McCain, and Senator Lindsey Graham mentioned the expansion of the fight against ISIS in Afghanistan. The Washington Post writing that the administration has granted the new military authority to strike the Islamic State in Afghanistan. Missy Ryan writes that while the decision does not signal a dramatic change for U.S. activities in Afghanistan, it strengthens commanders' authority against assorted militants there and more generally illustrates the expanding U.S. campaign against the Islamic State beyond its home base. That's from the Washington Post.